Is the band back together? Has Gavin Riley gotten Oasis back together?
You had one job, Gav.
I had one job.
This is your reaction from the meeting last week.
I had one job and then two stomachs got in the way. No, the band is not back together because I didn't manage to make it to Nebworth.
It wasn't because of Dublin Airport.
No, it wasn't because of Dublin Airport. It was because of my toddler's dippy tummy because unfortunately she had her very first encounter of a stomach bug the day before we were supposed to go. And even the night before we were supposed to fly, we've been making arrangements with my parents that were going to come up early the following morning to tag team into the house so that we could go in time for the early morning flight. And then
the parental guilt got you.
Parental guilt. And also the fact that she had been asleep and then woke up to get sick. So couldn't go. So managed to make it to Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds on Sunday night, which was great. And I made my implorations to get the band back together, but without collaborations on both sides, just never going to work.
If the male Gallaghers are listening, please bring them back.
We pray to Saint Peggy
If you want to come on the group chat and we'll do third-party negotiation here.
Peggy, please just make it happen.
Hello, you're very welcome along to the Group Chat podcast. I'm news correspondent Zara King and I'm joined by my fellow news correspondent Richard Chambers.
Hello.
And political correspondent Gavin Riley.
Hey, hello.
Hello guys, you've had a good week?
Yeah, barring the aforementioned tummy bug, which then I got, which resulted in my first ever sick day. Actually, my second ever sick day ever in 12 and a half years of working full-time.
Yeah, I'm saying
my second sick day yesterday.
I haven't had an antibiotic in 12 years. I boast about it all the time.
It's good. It's good for society that you're not using antibiotics, that we're not building up that
it's probably good for climate that I didn't take a short hop flight to England at the weekend as well, which I know we'll get to in a couple of minutes' time. But sure, let's all look at the positives from not being sick or being sick.
Richard, we're going to start with you. You've been working on this story today about petrol prices. I suppose retailers calling on the government to urgently revisit that tax on fuel. You've been on the forecourts?
I've been out and about trying to chat to people on garage forecourts. Nobody's happy. No. Retailers aren't happy. I can't imagine anybody who's trying to fill a car and run a car for a family or run a business which depends on cars or lorries or trucks is happy at the moment. So we're well past that €2 per litre mark now, probably soaring towards €2.30 per litre at this point and possibly beyond.
Tell you who's happy. Pascal Donoghue, with all the taxis taken in as a result.
I'd say he wouldn't admit to being happy about these sort of things. I think that'd be politically devastating. But effectively, we're at a point now. I was chatting to a number of different people today out in the Dublin-Meath border, actually, just basically chatting to commuters and people filling up their cars in the middle of the day about how it's affecting them. People were talking about how they're having to skip family visits at weekends, how it's making it more difficult to run their business, all these sort of things. It's hitting everybody, and not just because of specifically the price of fuel, but if you're paying out more and more and more to fill a car, well, then you have less money to do everything else. So something else takes a hit along the way. So here's just a few examples of what people were saying to us a little bit earlier on.
I mean, you have to put fuel in the tank to go to either pick kids up from school or keep the truck on the road and keep the business ticking. Like, you have no choice, you know.
I work every single day, so it's ridiculous. I'd be here and there, like we're hoped and done more and stuff like that for work. I build and stuff like that, so it's ridiculous.
Wicked. Yeah. Terrible. Look here.
212 cents per litre.
Yeah. The last time it was just over 200 and that was bad enough.
So I think it's really clear from what we're hearing from people there is they literally cannot afford any more expense in terms of fuel. I know some people that I spoke to during the week talking about the cost of living were saying that the first thing to go really was kind of the Sunday spin, you know, taking the kids out for the Sunday spin. They would have gone maybe to the seaside, which would have been maybe a 30-40 minute drive for them. That was something they would have done every Sunday, particularly, you know, in the summertime. Or even one girl said to me, actually, she used to visit her 89-year-old grandmother 4 times a week. And she's like, I'm going to see Granny once a week now because I just can't afford to actually visit her. So that lady is now not getting the amount of visits from her loved one that she would have normally gotten. Like, I know that sounds really tedious, but that's kind of the lived reality of what people are going through now in terms of that pinch.
And the thing is that pretty much everyone accepts that it's not just going to level off at 215 or 220, that it's going to get higher. Because I know our economics correspondent Paul Colgan was doing some work today about how much more the price of a barrel of crude oil is going to go and what that's probably likely to translate into the pump. And it was put to some ministers in the Dáil last week that it could get to like 250 by the middle of by later in the summer. And there wasn't any pushback or any kind of dissent being like, no, you're talking crazy. It was sort of accepted as being a natural consequence. And it's partly a consequence of what we were talking about last week, the new move to boycott most Russian oil, which even though Ireland doesn't use much of it, the rest of the world does. So oil just now becomes proportionately that bit more scarce. So there's nothing else you can do. But also because, you know, oil is where we've gone past peak oil, where we are slowly globally, we are running out of oil. So it's only ever going to go one way. There isn't going to be some magical tipping point in a couple of months, even if the war in Ukraine were to end satisfactorily, where people will just go, oh, it's grand now, back to the prices we were. Like, this is probably going to be the new normal. So the world's going to have to do some pretty drastic stuff to be able to live with it.
Did anyone speak to you today about, like, I suppose, the idea of, moving to electric, conversation?
Interestingly enough, I was chatting to one petrol station owner and he was basically saying, well, look, we have that facility here. We don't have enough cars on the road which are doing that. But that is interesting.
People don't pay to charge, do they, at petrol stations, or how does that work?
Generally not. Generally not for most from the way it is for most setups there, it isn't. But obviously that'll probably change. Or
they're going to phase out the free public charges at the side of the streets or whatever, because they actually need to incentivise petrol pump owners to install one and for people to use them. So they're actually getting rid of the free ones.
But what is interesting is that there has clearly been, over the first 5 months of the year, definitely a shift in terms of what new cars people are buying. There's been basically a doubling of the new of electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids which have been bought. At the same time, the amount of used cars being bought has plummeted, as well as that the number of new diesel cars also come down. So effectively, you are seeing, to some degree, a slow creep now towards the electric to plug-in hybrids, because people, whether that's because they want to be environmentally conscious or because of the fact that fossil fuels are now completely, effectively extortionate in terms of the price that people are asked to pay for them now. And even if you're trying to, heat a house at this point, you'll know all about the cost of these things. So there's definitely a shift going on at the moment. There will be further incentives, all that sort of stuff to try and get more people onto it. But it is going to be, one of the key environmental questions which we're going to be asking ourselves for quite some time to come.
It kind of brings us on nicely to our guest, actually, who's joined the group chat this week. We've been speaking to Dr. Cara Augustenborg, who is joining us now from Trinity College. Good evening, Cara.
Hi,
how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast with us this week. Cara, look, we're going to begin with, I suppose, the EPA report last week pointing to the fact that there needs to be urgent implementation in terms of the climate plans and policies. In terms of Ireland's target to reduce the emissions by 51% by 2030, how are we doing with that?
Well, what the EPA report that came out last week said was that even if we implement all of the plans in the last climate action plan, which was published in 2019, we will only reduce emissions by about 28% between now and 2030. And while that's enough to meet our EU obligations, unfortunately, we've actually raised the bar since then. The new government has put in a target of 51% by 2030. So we are not going to meet that target based on the current action plan, which means we need to create a new action plan.
So is that to say, Cara, that we've gone to the likes of COP26, we've signed up to all these global treaties where we're going to agree to try and slash our emissions by half, and we've legislated for carbon budgets and all that other sort of stuff, but we haven't actually produced any plan on how we're actually going to reduce our emissions?
Well, part of the problem with that is the timing. So we had a new government. They created a new climate action plan relatively soon after they came into government. And then the new legislation was passed. So we always knew this was going to be an issue. And they have always committed to doing another climate action plan that's in line with the new legislation. So that means that we should see a new climate action plan around about September or November of this year. And we would hope that that plan has to come up with enough plans and policies that we actually do hit that 51% target. So it's more of a timing issue than an issue of failure at this stage.
Cara, can I ask why in Ireland we seem to constantly, every single year, maybe twice or three times a year, we hear how we are lagging far behind what our climate targets are, and that we are going to be in line for serious fines as the financial or the economic cost of this. But obviously the detriment of our planet is the ultimate problem here. Why are we consistently falling behind what we should be doing? Like, what sectors in Ireland, or what industries, or what elements of Irish society and business have really sort of led us down in this?
Well, part of the reason is that, of course, the longer we take to not do anything and to kick the can down the road, the more we have to do later on to meet those targets. So it gets harder and harder the more we delay. At the moment now, we're at the process where each of the sectors are setting their sectoral emissions targets, is what they say. So what they're going to do to stay within these new carbon budgets. So they're going to divide up the pie essentially between these sectors. And obviously energy, electricity has been leading the way, and that we have a lot of wind turbines now. They've been doing pretty well, and they have a vision to completely decarbonize by around 2036. So that's very positive. Transport, not so much. And of course, as the economy grows and we come out of COVID, we're seeing the emissions from transport going way up again. So we really need that kind of sustainable and active transport to come into play. And that's going to take time. When we build these cycle lanes and we start creating more public transport, it takes time to start seeing the emissions going down from that. And the big question mark now is with agriculture, because there's just been a blind spot essentially to their obligation to reduce emissions for a really long time. And a lot of energy has been wasted by the agricultural sector in saying that they shouldn't necessarily have to do anything or have to do as much to meet those targets. So they're not being asked to do as much. They're being asked to do somewhere between 22 and 30% emissions reductions compared to about 50% from the other sectors. But they're still saying even that's too much for them. So that's going to be the big question mark going forward.
Just one thing that I sort of feel watching the political debate around climate change in this country is, you know, how much we long finger things, how much we put things back, how often we seem to be revel as a government and as a society, and we can call it out as a problem. So Ireland, I think, was the second country in the world to declare a climate emergency, and yet we still don't meet our targets. We're good on climate talk, but climate action is a different thing entirely. I mean, do you feel that the likelihood is that we're still going to be debating things like the carbon tax, like farm emissions, like, you know, transport and energy production at a time when, you know, things have already changed too far? I mean, we're talking about the 1.5 degrees increase in global temperatures and how detrimental that will be for all of us. Like, what are we seeing around the world as we speak that should be setting off alarm bells to us that we have probably let things go too far already?
I think what we're seeing in Ireland is that the current government is far more progressive on climate action than we've seen in any government. So we have a lot more ambitious plans and policies being committed to, but the question is around implementation. So are those going to be implemented fast enough to get the emissions down? I mean, we're seeing commitments from the current minister, Eamon Ryan, that things will start happening in the next 2 years, that they're really accelerating things in the same way that the government accelerated action around COVID. So hopefully that will happen and that will be really positive. But I think every country around the world is struggling with some. The Biden administration in the US is saying that they're really worried about meeting their energy targets, that the whole solar industry has completely collapsed in America because of trade issues with China. So it's not easy for any country to make this big transformation away from fossil fuels. And I think Ireland, it's probably harder for us because we've left it so late.
And Cara, in terms of engagement in all of this, of course, we're seeing huge action, particularly from younger people, and it's really refreshing to see that. But there's always going to be people who sort of aren't engaged in this, who'll say, oh, it's kind of not really my problem, or I'm not that interested in it. Was it fair to say that if you're not panicking at this point, then you clearly don't understand the problem?
Yeah, but I think it's human nature to not panic and to try and, you know, to go, oh my God, that's shocking, and then forget about it later. We see that with all sorts of problems. We see it in America with gun control legislation, and every time there's a shooting, that's the only thing on the airwaves, and then people very quickly forget. And maybe that's part of being human, and it's hard to get your head around these big global challenges. But certainly the news is shocking and terrifying, and if you read it every day like I do, then you're very aware that our future is very precarious, and the future of our children is very precarious, and life is going to get much harder very quickly if we don't take action soon and try and halt or limit global warming.
What do you say, Cara, to the argument that some other, I don't want to say climate skeptics, but people who are a bit sort of negative or skeptical about the necessity for countries like Ireland to do anything? They'll always put the argument that, you know, major corporations are responsible for so many emissions, or larger industrial countries like the USA or China are responsible for so much, that in the grand scheme of things, if Ireland were not to meet its obligations, it would only be a drop in the ocean, that it's those bigger countries that really carry the sway, and that therefore Ireland really shouldn't be forcing citizens to make uncomfortable choices about their lives just to save the planet, when they're not going to be the ones that make the difference.
Yeah, it's the number one question that gets asked in the media, actually. And the truth is, if every country took that attitude that we're only small and what we do doesn't matter, a quarter of emissions are represented by countries like Ireland that are less than 2% of emissions globally. So all the small countries also have to do their part in order to solve climate change. A quarter of emissions is as big as the United States. So we all need to chip in to do it. And as to the question about whether, it's corporations, of course, you can say it's corporations that are contributing to emissions, but they're contributing because we as individuals choose to buy their products. So we drive those emissions from corporations, and we drive those emissions from China in particular because we buy a lot of our products from China. So the carbon footprint of a country or of people in China individually is much smaller than people in Western Europe and in the United States. But it's the fact that they manufacture all these goods for people like us that drives their emissions upwards.
Cara, for people who are looking for real world or real life examples about what might happen here within the next couple of decades as a result of climate change, is there anything you could point to around the world as an example of the sort of climate changing in a very obvious and detrimental way that we could expect to happen here without the sort of action that we need to take, and which we obviously haven't taken so far?
Yeah, I think for Ireland, there's a few things. So sea level rise is going to be a big problem globally, but what researchers are finding in the Newth University is that sea level rise is happening in places like Dublin much faster than they predicted, and to a much greater extent than other parts of the world. So that's a big concern for people who live near the coast, which is a majority of our population. And it's also a big concern for our infrastructure. So if you think about our Dart line, for example, it is right on the ocean, and it's at huge risk of falling into the sea because of climate change. And then I think the other big risk for us is on food production, because a majority of our food is actually imported from other countries. So when they struggle with a changing climate, as we're seeing in places like India right now, that affects the ability for them to be able to export food to us. So particularly when it comes to grain right now, the Ukraine isn't able to produce grain because of their conflict. And India said they would step in and be able to fill that gap. But now India is experiencing an incredible drought across the country. So I think we're going to start to see food prices go up, and that's going to affect us here in Ireland. And food availability eventually will affect us too. So that is the big concern, I think, for us here in Ireland.
That is the reality of it. Dr. Cara Augustenborg, thank you so much for joining the group chat. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Cara Augustenborg there, and I think interesting as she's sort of finishing off on, the real world impacts of this are now so stark. We've talked about the food crisis based on, the amount of grain that cannot now leave Ukraine.
The breadbasket of the world.
Effectively, everybody was like, oh, India will help with that. India has had unprecedented heat waves. The yield of corn, maize that's going to be coming out of there is so drastically down.
There's some places in India and Pakistan in the last couple of weeks that have had temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
People are going to starve in their thousands as a result of climate change. And that is something which I don't think we draw the line between often enough, I think.
It'll actually be funny to see whether there is a kind of a tipping point in consciousness later this summer, because I remember talking a couple of weeks ago to the CEO of Oxfam Ireland, who was pointing out they've got a new study where with a combination of COVID and the way that it's still ravaging through some parts of Africa, which don't have the same equitable access to vaccines, so they're getting it far worse, between droughts that they have now where crops continually fail year on year on year, and Ukraine and India both falling through as their fallback options. Somalia, for example, has a population of around 16 million people. And Oxfam's estimate is that this summer alone, one summer, 350,000 children alone will die of starvation because of the failure of their own food and the failure of other countries to come up with it. So much of which, obviously a bit of it is down to Russia and Ukraine, but a lot of it is down to crops just not growing because it's too hot anymore. Yeah. And if that's going to become the new normal, then we have some serious reckonings on our hands.
It's really shocking. What other things do you think in your own life that you're starting to become a bit more aware of, a bit more conscious? I think it's funny, do you know what's recently I've noticed probably more than ever? I think this move towards moving away from fast fashion is really interesting in a sense that there was a time where people bought something, wore it once and, never wore it again, cheap fashion, cheap clothing. I think now there's definitely, I feel more conscious now about wearing what I own already. And I don't know, is that it's just something that's crept in over the last year where I feel way more, even I was going to a friend's wedding, to Nicole Gurn and her colleague's wedding, and I wore a skirt that I've owned for 15 years. And I thought, that's a lovely skirt. But why not wear that skirt that I've had for 15 years to a wedding? Otherwise, you would have been buying something new. You're contributing to that vicious cycle all the time.
Do you remember that used to be more acceptable, though, until Bebo happened? And then there would be photographs of you at a do or at your cousin's wedding or on a night out. And then if the photo album went up of you on another night out or another event a month later, and you're wearing the
but
same
I love
stuff.
that's changed now.
That's when it became a faux pas. But like, it's actually, it was a dreadful modern phenomenon that it suddenly became a thing where you couldn't wear something more than once or twice.
I think the you know, the tide is really turning on that. You see that even on Love Island.
Yeah.
Love Island this year, all the contestants are the clothes are from eBay. Effectively.
Yeah.
Even the sort of the rise of the vintage shop.
Yeah.
Everything is sort of, you know,
Pre-loved.
Pre-loved,
yeah.
You get cooler stuff as well, effectively.
No, honestly, I do think some of the stuff is much nicer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also think as well, like delving into what you own already. Like I know this sounds a bit preachy, but like I felt even like going through, I moved house recently and going through boxes and boxes of stuff and thinking, all this stuff that we've had for so long, you can almost go shopping in your own wardrobe or delve into, you know, even for example, there's makeup that I found in a drawer at home last weekend that is perfect makeup. It's sealed and unopened that I probably bought ages ago with great intentions and never used, which is an awful waste, and thought I'm going to repurpose that and start using it again. And I think these are small things that I know they're not going to change the world, but like they're definitely small, subtle things that I think all of us are starting to perhaps see in our own lives.
If every Western consumer did exactly that, it would make a big difference.
I totally agree. I think just when you see some of the kind of the websites that are selling clothes for very, very cheap, like I mean, there's, you know, places selling dresses for under €10, and you think, what are the consequences of that?
But actually, there was a fascinating piece as well, not to get too far off the topic, but there was a really good piece this week in the Irish Times by Sally Hayden, who was actually a college contemporary of myself and Richard's. She was involved in the University Observer at the same time as we were. She's now like basically an Africa correspondent for the Irish Times. And she had a really good piece about how a lot of African markets are selling what used to be cast-offs or donations from the North and the Western Hemisphere. And now, because of fast fashion, so much of charity donations that end up in African markets are just like disposable €2 tops that no one ever wants to wear again. And how even their own economies, that they find themselves then, firstly, the economic thing of not being able to sell them on because it's a diswanted garment that nobody wants. But then secondly, there's an environmental impact with the West's clothes just piling up in Africa because they were donated to Africa and no one wants them there either. And they're just piling up. And the better we can do to be more economical with what we've got.
I think it's so refreshing. I work a lot with young social innovators. You know, I do kind of their annual awards with them every year, and I think that the teenagers now are so much better than we were as teenagers, in a sense that they're just so, I don't know, I'm so impressed by how teenagers now are so conscious of that. And like there's no pressure within that cohort now to be wearing something once and never wearing it again. I think that they're so much more conscientious about it, and it's so refreshing to see that. And I think it takes the pressure off as well from all perspectives to be, you know, accepted because you have this brand new thing. Actually kind of showing your creativity and having the ability to go into your wardrobe and style something based on what you already own seems to be far more trendy or far more kind of popular now.
What's the oldest piece of clothes that you own? That you'd still might actually
that I'd still wear. I'd say that skirt. Well, I'm trying to think. Definitely the skirt. I got that skirt when I was 15 in Monsoon, and it's beautiful. And I wore it. I wore it on the work night out last week with a crap t-shirt. Yeah.
I have a fleece I got from my confirmation that I
still wear it.
It was very oversized, but I still wear it.
I was just going to say you're still getting
Absolutely
into it.
unbelievable. That's unbelievable. Not a mark kind of thing. Absolute beast of a fleece.
What about you?
Probably the white away shirt for Ireland's World Cup 2002 campaign.
But that's kind of vintage, isn't it? Like I guess those jerseys and stuff are quite.
I've had Carchester jerseys from around the
days.
same time that I'd probably still wear the odd time.
I actually I still have my Deb's dress in a wardrobe at home at my parents' house, and I considered repurposing it for a wedding, and then I thought maybe not. That probably wouldn't fit me at this point, but.
Yeah, I just think generally like that's one element. Absolutely, the clothes and upcycling, recycling, or whatever you want to do. There's a lot of
bigger issues.
There's a lot of lifestyle changes which are going to be asked of all of us over the next couple of years.
So new research by the Health Research Board has shown a 170% increase in young people being treated for cocaine use. Now, this was over a 9-year period. Were you surprised by that?
170%. Like, I suspected it was widespread, but I didn't think that it would have basically have trebled in the space of about 9 years. Like, I'm a little bit surprised by the gravity of that. But then again, I actually don't know why I'm surprised, given the amount of anecdotal stories that we've all heard and that other people have heard about how commonplace the likes of cocaine is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just when you see the prevalence of it. And I think there has been a societal change really towards almost a social acceptance that it's really, especially over the last number of years, maybe 3 or 4 years. It's just the other side of the pandemic, I would say, where it really has become, it's like every pub, every restaurant, every club, just every town has probably got a fairly large, volume of cocaine, just casually being used by people in the town, and that's across multiple different age groups. I think that what's interesting about the study from today was effectively the age issue on this is something which actually is something which did shock me. Probably.
Well, these are 15 to 24-year-olds. That's the age profile involved in this research.
But then does that speak to a bigger cultural shift where once upon a time teenagers sort of, that their grand illicit adventure was having a few cans before you were legally allowed to go buy them? Has that now just translated into that being so commonplace that now teenagers will routinely have cocaine before they're even of drinking age?
Well, what I would say, before we move on to answer that question, what I would say is actually Julie O'Toole, who I met today, is a remarkable individual. So Julie first took drugs when she was 14. She was a drug addict from the age of 14 to 22. So that would have been in the late 80s, right up to 1996. She took her last drug in 1996. Julie wrote a book about her drug addiction. It's called Heroin, A True Story of Addiction, Hope and Triumph. And I was talking to her today about this research, and I was saying to her, are you surprised? She was not a bit surprised whatsoever. But just the point that you make, I suppose, obviously she was involved in drug addiction from a really young age back in the late 80s, early 90s. So I don't know, has it really, maybe the type of drugs that are available now have changed possibly, but Julie was saying today that, she sees cocaine everywhere. She sees, ecstasy, cocaine and ecstasy. Ireland has the second highest consumption of cocaine and ecstasy in young people in Europe. And, Julie said today that really this comes as no surprise. It was, surrounding everyone. She said she knows children as young as primary school age who have been offered cocaine and are taking cocaine, which I was really surprised here. We can take a listen to what she had to say this afternoon.
Well, I know for a fact a 12-year-old was taking cocaine and smoking grass, and that's very fair. Well, I started at 13, 14, but that's extremely young, still in primary school. If you look at cocaine was called the rich man's drug at one stage, but now it has no barriers. It doesn't respect any man, any woman.
So I suppose, look, Julie is speaking there about cocaine, formerly known as a rich man's drug, now widely available. She also said, which I thought was really interesting, is that she would regularly drug test her own kids. She's kids kind of early teens, mid-teens. Now, that's obviously coming from a place of her own sort of awareness. She does it not because her children, she doesn't believe they're, but she says she wants to do it as a precautionary measure in her own household.
She's still living in the same community that she grew up in.
Yeah, the same community, yeah.
You can sort of understand then, even though it might seem maybe overzealous to some people, you can understand that she's desperate to make sure that her children don't end up falling down the same traps that she did.
Definitely, yeah. But it's not just her, though. I spoke to an addiction counsellor in South Dublin who said that he's aware of a lot of families who are regularly drug testing their kids at home as well, which I was really surprised to hear that.
Yeah, and without being a parent, I don't want to step across and sort of commentate on what other people think is best for their families and all that sort of stuff. That is interesting. That is surprising. I think I'd
never heard of that, if I'm totally honest.
I haven't heard of that. And you know what? Actually, it's just so interesting. Just as I think about it, and we're talking about the age profile of people using cocaine. It's so interesting. If you're ever on TikTok, just how rampant and open kids of young age are about taking cocaine.
Really? On TikTok, really?
Yeah. You'll just come across it, and it's when people are describing nights out and stuff like that, or there'll be popular memes based around, going off to the bathroom effectively with a bag of cocaine. This is something which is really, really socially acceptable now at a younger age. And as we're sort of saying, it has morphed from being something which was exclusive or seen as exclusive before to something which is, absolutely the norm.
It's kind of funny how these things can then be normalised, because I knew that they often use the likes of Snapchat because of just the disappearing messages, that people would go incognito and that there would be basically dealers on Snapchat who would always be able to sort you out with the supply, because then the messages would disappear and there'd be no proof of anything. But the idea that it's so normalised and so regularised in their society that they would openly even joke in a sort of a casual, memeified way about going to the toilet, it only just speaks to how these things can culturally change over time. I was talking to older family members at the weekend, and we were talking about how once upon a time there was a culture of accepting a moderate amount of drink driving. I'm not saying driving while drunk, but that once upon a time there was a generation, our parents' generations, would have thought it was acceptable to have one or two and still get behind the wheel. And I feel
particularly in rural spots where maybe taxis and things weren't available.
I feel that we probably grew up of an era where you just didn't. It just was the done thing. You don't have one and drive. You have none if you're driving. That's what they've done. And yet, so quickly, then you've moved to a culture where teenagers just think that openly talking about the use of illegal drugs is so common that you wonder then, is there a drug driving habit breaking in that we don't know about? I'm just kind of aghast that not only is it so commonplace, but that they're so open about it. Yeah. But then again, I don't know why I'm so shocked about that, because we see so many pieces about how it's so common in sports club rooms. There was a piece in the Sunday Independent a few weeks ago about how it's really commonplace in schools' rugby culture, and there was a piece in the Indo a few years back about how it's common in rural GAA clubhouses because young lads love it because it gives them a good buzz for the night. It's not much dearer than drink, and there's no hangover. So they feel like it's an ideal night out. And why would you be paying for drink when minimum unit pricing is as it is now and drink is so prohibitive that for them it just seems like the natural progression to spend your night doing?
Well, I suppose, look, you know, you've covered the Guinean cartel, I suppose the big clampdown on them in recent weeks. I mean, that's, you know, the money's coming from somewhere. Like, something is fueling that, you know what I mean? It's not, those businesses are booming for a reason in a lot of ways, you know? Yeah,
it was interesting as well. I was reading in the Irish Times on Wednesday, Kitty Holland's article about just sort of, you know, delving into real world experiences of this. And I was interested to see, to read about, you know, how young people were still taking cocaine even though pubs and clubs were closed. That
yes,
basically
actually,
you're still out in parks and stuff like that. And I was like, that is interesting. Like, I mean, I can understand, I suppose, that there is people in that demographic who are inclined to take drugs would be like, well, I'm just going to do it anyway. Like, people were still drinking and stuff anyway.
So less a party drug and more a pastime drug.
Yeah, I just found it interesting. I suppose it is something which I suppose it's one of these things that everybody knows about but doesn't perhaps talk about as much, I think.
I've never been offered a drug, actually. Honestly, I said this to you earlier and you were kind of laughing at me, but I was like, no one's ever...
I wasn't after
Do I just have a face where someone wouldn't offer me a drug or something? I don't know.
All that a gas, because I was offered a drag of a joint on a night link once, literally once.
Do you think people think we're total squares and they wouldn't offer us?
Well, I think I've always given off the ambience of a square. I don't think there's ever...
Me too. The fact that we're all sitting here is absolute proof that we are not massive squares.
Squares, I know.
Richard, you were saying earlier on that like you have a bit of an issue with the way in which there are some places that are unfairly pastiched as being homes of drug culture.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't want to like criticise anybody's work because this is obviously work, and that's what their sources were giving them. But like there was a talk about League of Ireland grounds in one publication online being, you know, the focus of Garda inquiries about cocaine use. And I just found that interesting because League of Ireland grounds is such a niche thing in the grand scheme of cocaine use in this country.
There are 9 used every weekend.
Yeah, like I mean, we could look a lot closer to home for places. You know what I mean? If it is such a common thing amongst young people in pubs, clubs, nightclubs, anywhere around the country. It's very interesting that that we're looking into a particular demographic of people who are just sports fans or whatever. Like, I have seen people openly use cocaine in sports grounds. I've seen them in pubs and stuff and bathrooms and all that sort of stuff as well. That happens. It shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. And I think that when you almost try and pigeonhole or you try and focus too much on, well, here's one place that they do it, you're kind of closing yourself off to the broader societal problem, I think.
Dr. Garrett McGovern, who I interviewed today, was saying he runs an addiction service in South Dublin. He was saying, I suppose, the key thing really about cocaine in terms of the risk is that obviously it's an unregulated product, so you don't know what you're taking, and that's kind of one of the key risks he thinks that people take. He said he's been aware of people who've, you know, died from whatever you want to call it, a bad batch, and that he thinks that, you know, across the board, that's kind of the risk, I guess, you take in something like that. It's not as if somebody's going to say, oh yeah, you know, this batch has been cleared and is you know what I mean? There's no way of knowing, I suppose, what you're consuming in that setting, and that's one of the highest risk elements to it. Okay, so it's something we'll definitely come back to again, I think. It's an interesting talking point. And actually, it might be nice to hear from some of our listeners on this one, actually, about
I think experiences would be interesting.
Experiences would be interesting, anonymously.
We can guarantee anonymity, so if anyone wants to get in touch and tell us about their experiences of taking drugs and how they started taking them and why they do it.
I think school us a little bit and let us know kind of what the reality is where you're from.
Prove that you're less square than we are.
Yeah, absolutely. So contact any of us on social media about that. And like I say, we can guarantee anonymity. We might come back to it next week, a couple of the real life anecdotes. Just want to rattle through a couple of other things that have happened this week. If you haven't seen this, I would highly recommend taking a look at Matthew McConaughey speaking at the White House. Richard, you texted this to me last night. He was very upset. Yeah, this is a guy who is from Uvalde in Texas, where, of course, that horrific school shooting was. A really emotional response from Matthew McConaughey here.
Maite wore green high-top Converse with a heart she had hand-drawn on the right toe because they represented her love of nature. Camilla's got these shoes. Can you show these shoes, please? Wore these every day. Green Converse with a heart on the right toe. These are the same green Converse on her feet that turned out to be the only clear evidence that could identify her after the shooting. How about that? But again, you know what every one of these parents wanted, what they asked us for? what every parent separately expressed in their own way to Camilla and me, that they want their children's dreams to live on. That they want their children's dreams to continue to accomplish something after they are gone. They want to make their loss of life matter.
It's such a universal thing, isn't it, to imagine like a child wearing Converse that they love, and for it like to be such a common thing. Like it's one of the things actually that I think makes the story slightly more approachable from a worldwide perspective, because you know we've talked before about America's weird fascination with guns and how it's so critical to their culture, which in some ways makes the story kind of, it others it in some ways. It's not a thing that happens here, but like kids with their favourite pair of shoes with a little heart drawn on because they like the natural world, that's such a universal thing. And it really just brings the whole thing home in ways that it might not otherwise.
Yeah.
Uvalde has been, you know, one of those things that's not going away, and I think the pressure for change is heavier now than it's ever been.
Yeah, but again, like we've discussed, the Democrats have a majority in the House. They have the White House. They have tie-breaking votes in the Senate. What are they going to do with it? They're going to turn it into an electoral issue. So elect us in November and we can do all that stuff.
But it's also
a mandate now. Do it now.
Yeah, it's interesting, Zara. If you're saying that the pressure is higher than it's ever been, the resistance is probably as high as it's ever been too. For all these motions, there is always going to be that backlash. I saw one Republican senator there today trying to compare it to post 9/11, saying, well, we didn't ban planes after 9/11, which is, I mean, kind of negates the fact that it became incredibly difficult to get on planes post 9/11 as well. But this is going to be something that's going to just
still putting your holiday
keep on going.
You have to do a background check to fly a Boeing 737 though, so you know there were some changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Boris Johnson is still hanging in there.
Still hanging in there.
Survived that vote.
British Prime Minister is just hanging on.
The interview he gave after he survived the vote. Can we take a second?
Where he was
I can't believe that he just kept repeating, "Got to get on with the business of the day." Like he looked.
Decisive result.
He looked quite. Didn't he look quite? Like he looked a bit rattled, I have to say. It's the first time I've seen him.
Wouldn't you?
When he got booed going into the Platinum Jubilee into St Paul's Cathedral on Saturday.
It was probably an interesting tipping point because, like, if you have a lot of like last week was basically a non-political week in Britain because it was Platty Jubs week. Jubs? Platty Jubs. It's one of those words I've only seen written down.
Yeah.
So it was Platty Jubs week, so there was no politics. It was like 4-day weekend, so politics wasn't happening. And then when people are at home watching the BBC's coverage and they see the Prime Minister being booed by like royalists, by people who
Conservative voters,
people who spend the night camped outside a cathedral because they want to get like a 10-second glimpse of a royal. They're people who are they're into conservative institutions by their nature. Are booing a Conservative Prime Minister. You know you've lost the room.
I think his wife's face gave it away for a second. I think she was slightly surprised with the booing. She sort of glanced back and there was a moment of like, oh, I think this is a bit awkward.
I thought it was very telling actually when he did the interview on Monday night after he survived, and he almost kind of reverted to type where he, you know, one of the things he said, but the things he kept repeating was, we're gonna get it done.
Oh yeah.
Get what done?
I know.
Because like Brexit is done. So what are you going to get done? It. Are you going to do it?
Yeah.
Hashtag get it done.
He kept saying cost of living, the British public don't care about the cost of living, we're going to get on with things.
But what is fascinating is that we all portrayed, or we in the political media, we compared it to other Tory votes of confidence that there's been in, you know, Thatcher or in Theresa May. And we've said, oh, you know, he has more people against him than any of them ever did. And therefore the assumption being that there was some irresistible force would come along to just nudge him out. And we're recording this 48 hours later. Nothing's happened.
I don't think anybody thought though that it would happen if he survives the vote that he'd be gone in a couple of days. There is a feeling that it'll happen, like that it's a slow death thing, that he's a wounded animal.
Within 6 months, you reckon, more so?
Yeah, you have people who know the Tory party inside out, and they're like, well, there's currently a rule that there can't be another vote of no confidence in him within 12 months. There's a feeling now that
you could change the rules.
The rebels are going to change the rules.
He did try to remove the head of the 1922 committee, didn't he? So that couldn't. Like, I mean, he is absolutely.
He's a survivor, though. He is so canny at these situations, and
the self-belief is admirable almost.
Things that would
chutzpah
scupper any other politician or any other prime minister seem to just bounce off him to a certain degree. It will be interesting. It is interesting, though, that there is a sense of inevitability that is still there. While it hasn't happened yet, there is a feeling that it might just be a couple of months delayed.
And maybe the vulnerability is, maybe it's the next time that he tries to do anything. And one of the things that he might try to do is this much briefed attempt to try and undermine certain parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the unique trading arrangement for the North post-Brexit, make some changes to domestic law so that some of the nasty stuff that they don't like simply goes away. And there's a sense that he's going to try and appease the most hardline people in the backbenches of the Tory party. I reckon that they're the people whose votes he's already got. And I think that the interesting thing is that bill was promised on Tuesday and then on Wednesday and then on Thursday. Now the talk is it's not going to be till next Monday. I suspect Number 10 won't publish that bill until they know for certain that he's got the votes to pass it, because he doesn't want to do what Theresa May did, continually publishing Brexit-related stuff, knowing that he doesn't have the votes to pass it. And anytime he tries to do anything now will be an interesting time as to whether there's a tipping point.
Yeah, and just, I suppose, speaking of the Platinum Jubilee, just in relation to a lot of people would have wondered, I suppose, about the Harry and Meghan element. That kind of passed off really with that incident. They had one public appearance. One of the days they released a photo of their daughter Lilibet after her first birthday, which they had a birthday party the weekend.
She got her father's genes.
Yeah, she did actually. She did.
The photograph thing was interesting. I saw some really good commentary on that as just an example as to why they want nothing to do with the general royal family and the British media, because I find it exceedingly weird, the coverage of a photograph of a 1-year-old child.
It was everywhere, it was everywhere.
So more power to them. Platty Jubes was interesting, had a good laugh.
Did you read anything into the Queen's choice of outfit, Richard? I know you're a big fan of divining some messages.
For Green for that final moment on the balcony.
Yeah.
God, I'm emulating the Green myself here tonight.
There you go, yeah, a nice tribute to Lizzie the Queen
royal
from
by
Zara.
Name, royal by nature.
OK, before we go, we can't leave this week go by without wishing the best of luck to all our Leaving Cert listeners.
We should.
I'm going to say now, lads, I'm disappointed that you didn't bring us the Leaving Cert weather. Like, oh my God, today... The news at 12:30 today was, like, for me, was an utter disgrace. I'm going to call it what it was.
As someone who really, really suffered from the Leaving Cert weather in his Leaving Cert because I ran out of antihistamines in, like, the hottest week of 2004, I'm kind of happy enough, actually, that this year's batch are going around with a slightly soggy, overcast week. There's nothing worse than being in boarding school for your Leaving Cert and running out of antihistamines on that fortnight of all fortnights. Dreadful result for all concerned.
God, Leaving Cert memories.
Tough run.
Were you stressed, or were you quite, like, I feel like you would have been the kind of kid that, like, was quite smart naturally, were you?
I was stressed.
I think you were sneaky.
I was very stressed. I had a terrible time with my Irish oral exam, I should say, sorry. I remember this exam period was rough enough. The weather was unbelievable for it. And then I think it was literally on the last day of the exam, just lashing rain, and it was a terrible summer afterwards. So yeah, maybe it'll change. So best of luck. Well,
best of luck, and look forward to it. Again, tell us your Leaving Cert stories if you want to get in touch. Let us know how you're getting on, and we will of course be delighted to hear from you. That's it for the group chat for this week. Thank you, political correspondent Gavin Riley.
Thank you, news correspondent Zara King.
Thank you, news correspondent Richard Chambers.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you next week. Thank you very much for joining us.
Bye.